project. To begin, I would like to invite Dr. Nuki, our Executive Director, to deliver his welcome remarks. So please, Dr. Nuki, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Hoyen Chan. It is a great pleasure for me to be here. Good morning, Professor Dr. Joy Jacqueline Pereira, the Southeast Asia Disaster Prevention Research Initiative, UKM, University Kebangsaan Malaysia, and also the Vice Chair of Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, Working Group 2 on Impacts, Adaptation, and Vulnerability. Dear guests, participants, ladies and gentlemen, again, very good morning. On behalf of ASEAN Center for Energy, it is my great pleasure to welcome you all here today to the ASEP sharing session, a series on climate risk and adaptation for 1.5-degree global warming in Southeast Asia. I wish to express my appreciation and thanks to Professor Joy once again for your kind help and also kind effort for sharing perspective and insight with us. It is indeed an honor for us to be able to host this sharing session. This event is organized, as Dr. Hoyen mentioned, under the initiative of ASEAN Climate Change and Energy Project, or we call it ASEP, which is funded by the Norwegian government. And besides knowledge sharing and raising awareness through sharing sessions, ASEP program will also actively publishing policy brief, articles and academic papers related to energy and climate change. And these publications are all available in our website and also ASEP website. Ladies and gentlemen, the ASEAN Economic Community, or AEC Blueprint, tackles the need for sustainable energy and climate change, and also energy transition towards sustainable development is one of the AEC priority economic deliverables in 2020. This will be achieved under the ASEAN Plan of Action for Energy Cooperation, or APAC, in 10-year plan from 2016 to 2025, which we are currently at the starting in the beginning of the second phase. And this year is the final year of the phase one.
Sorry, excuse me, but Nuki,
yes?
I think we cannot see you, the video lost. So I'm not sure whether is that the setting. Yeah, okay, now we can. Sorry for the interruption, now it's good.
Okay. Can I continue?
But is that okay? Because, yeah.
Okay, you lost me again?
We cannot see you, but we can hear you.
Okay. So I will wait a second, make a...
But we can hear you very clear.
You can hear me?
Yes.
Okay, that's very good. That's very good. So where are we? So ladies and gentlemen, basically beside the energy transition, another important agenda in this region is the, wait a second, I have to show myself again. Okay, is it now showing? Hoyen?
Yes, we can see you, Pak Nuki.
Okay, great. Sorry, because I cannot see the what you call it, the showing platform where we speak over here. So basically, the APEC, or the theme of APEC, is enhancing energy connectivity and market integration in ASEAN to achieve energy security, accessibility, affordability, and sustainability for all. Moving toward the APEC phase 2, we have a sub-theme, I think is quite important, of the accelerating energy transition and strengthening energy resilience through greater innovation and cooperation. Therefore, not only energy transition, but energy resilience is equally important under the regional energy cooperation framework. The energy transition itself, under the APEC framework, ASEAN set RE aspirational target, which is 23% of RE in the ASEAN total primary energy supply, or TPS, by 2020. And also energy intensity target to reduce 20% of energy intensity by 2020 and 30% by 2025. This APEC target also the energy transition target in the ASEAN Joint Statement to the United Nations Climate Action Summit 2019 last year. By setting this ambitious target, indeed, there are a climate change mitigation action in this region. Tackling climate change needs efforts for all levels. By understanding the climate risk in the region, not only this will improve our climate change preparedness, but also a more robust motivation of why we need aggressive mitigation action. Therefore, at ACE, our focus areas are energy-related studies. We open for new knowledge such as climate risk and also adaptation. Apart from the energy transition, another important agenda in this region is the energy resilience. Last week, we have a sharing session focused on the cyber resilience of the energy infrastructure. Nonetheless, another critical area of the energy resilience is in terms of the climate resilience of the energy system. Building resilience to climate change needs a fundamental knowledge of climate risk. With this knowledge, we could better plan for adaptation of the energy system to climate change. So today we are very fortunate. We have Professor Joy. Thank you for coming. As an expert of a great renown to share with us the climate risk and adaptation in this region. In fact, it is an important topic for all of us who live in Southeast Asia. We need to learn how important it is to keep the warming well below 1.5 degrees Celsius. And adaptation is always challenging. We need to act more aggressive in reducing the climate risk. And it is our responsibility to choose a livable future for the next generation. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope through this our sharing session initiative, this webinar, we also provide insight and raise awareness on climate change, thus accelerate the climate action in the region. Once again, I sincerely thanks to Professor Joy Jacqueline Pereira for her time and her contribution to knowledge sharing in this time. Lastly, I hope and also believe you will enjoy this sharing session. And I wish you good health during this pandemic period. Thank you very much. And I hope everybody, also the participant, enjoying this sharing session. Have a nice morning. Back to you, Hoyen.
Thank you, Pak Nuki. And this is such an inspiring address. So ladies and gentlemen, before I move to the next agenda, just let me say a few things about logistics in case you were not with us last time. So if during this webinar, you would like to pose a question, you are very much encouraged to do so. And what you do is simply type the question at the text box of the, the control panel of the GoToWebinar. And then I will draw the list of the question and then address to Professor Joy. So that's all about the logistic. And next is, let's move on. And before I introduce our guest speaker, we would like to invite you to participate in a poll survey. So this is to gain the insight from the public perception of climate change. So the question is like this. Which of the following best describe your perception on the effects of climate change? So you have 1 minute to answer. Right. Thank you. And now we see the result. Okay. Wow. Almost all of you is 90% that thought that a serious threat to human and the ecosystem. Great. So now we move to another question, which is very close to today's topic. Do you think we should limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So you have 4 options. Please choose one a minute from now. Thank you. And let's see. Okay, we have the majority, 64%, thought that we should limit the global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is also because of the mitigation costs rise over time and impact harms growth. So, okay, so you may want to find out more from Professor Joy Pereira. So let me turn to today's guest. So Professor Dr. Joy Jacqueline Pereira, welcome. And she is a principal research fellow at University Kebangsaan Malaysia's Southeast Asia Disaster Prevention Research Initiative, or better known as SIPRI UKM. And she is also a fellow of Academy of Sciences Malaysia. So Professor Pereira is the vice chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, Working Group 2 on Impacts, Adaptation, and Vulnerability. She was coordinating lead author for the Asia chapter of the IPCC 5th Assessment Report, released in March 2014. She is also the review editor for the 2012 IPCC Special Report on Managing the Risk of Extreme Event and Disaster to Advance Climate Change Adaptation. And she is also the lead author for the IPCC AR5 Synthesis Report. Professor Pereira is also a member of the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, Asia Pacific Science, Technology, and Academic Group, which supports governments in science-based decision-making to implement the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. And she is the director of the Asian Network on Climate Science and Technology, ANCST, working closely with the University of Cambridge. So our pleasure to have such a renowned expert with us today. Professor Joy, we all can't wait to learn from you the climate risk and adaptation for 1.5 degrees Celsius global warming in Southeast Asia. So over to you, Professor Joy.
Thank you, Dr. Chan. Good morning to everybody, Dr. Nuki especially, and colleagues from ACE, as well as all the everyone who is online with us today. It is such a pleasure for me to share some recent findings of the IPCC. And for your information, I know I am speaking to the already converted and believers of this group. 64% went for the right answer just now. So I have the pleasure of working with IPCC and being in SIPRI, University Kebangsaan Malaysia, and working with the Asian Network on Climate Science and Technology, where we actually alert the region whenever an IPCC report comes out and is ready for review. So in this context, I encourage you to look up Asian Network on Climate Science and Technology and register yourself and become a member so that you get an alert for the next IPCC report that comes out so you can give your review. There are very few opportunities left, and I will encourage you to share them to give your comments and see the reports before they are actually released. So with that, if I may just turn on to the next slide and introduce you to the IPCC, which is actually was established by the World Meteorology Organization and UNEP. And you may recall that we periodically bring out reports, and we won the Nobel Prize in 2007 for our work on the 4th assessment report jointly with the former Mr. Al Gore of the United States. So in terms of the reports, what has our reports done in terms of impacts? Our first assessment report led to the establishment of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and the most latest report has actually served from the IPCC science inputs provided, has served the Paris Agreement formulation. So in that context, our 6th assessment cycle is actually, we have several reports coming out in this cycle, and we've had the emissions inventory out in May, and the first report to come out was the 1.5 degrees Celsius report. We've had an ocean and cryosphere report come out and a land. So the next report to come out in 2021 will be the Working Group 1 Physical Science basis, which is a little bit delayed because of the pandemic situation, but you will have a chance to actually give input to this if you monitor the IPCC website, or you just register with ANGS and we will alert you. So I'll go to the first part of my work, the presentation today on where we are now. And we all know the atmosphere is changing fast. And you all know better than me, coming mainly from the energy sector, where this emission comes from the 35% from the energy sector, 24% from agriculture, and they're about the same amounts from industry, transportation, building. So what is the impact of this? So we have now established, the science has established that human influence is the main cause of these changes in the climate. And in a number of regions, we already have cold decreases in cold temperature extreme, increases in warm extreme, and higher sea levels, and higher number of heavy precipitation events. So in terms of the 1.5 degrees global warming, where are we now? So since pre-industrial time, for the first time, IPCC has now established, based on the science, that human activities have caused 1 degree of global warming. This was in 2018. And we are already seeing the consequences for people, nature, and livelihood. And at this current rate, we anticipate that we will reach 1.5 degrees between 2030 and 2052, but the past emissions alone do not commit us to this. We can change our pathway. So where will apathy take us? Let's just ignore the science, and then you will see these are the projections. Should you ignore the science, this gray bar here is 1 degree, and that's your baseline evidence-based data. And there are so many reasons for concern, among which that you see we are getting to the purple as you go to 1.5. There's unique and threatened systems will be at risk. And then extreme events will be coming to play in a 1.5 degree world. And you see the distribution of the impacts and global aggregated impacts all come into play, where the purple and the red indicates all these conditions that are projected based on the science as we have it now. So in terms of the risks for selected and natural and managed human systems, so what you see again, this gray horizontal bar here is the values between 2006 and 2015. So you'll see the higher as you go into the next gray horizontal line, which is 1.5 degrees. Our warm water corals are at risk. They are already widespread bleaching. That's evidence-based. We'll have problems with fisheries and the Arctic region. And then we'll have coastal floodings also occurring, fluvial flooding becoming an issue, and heat-related mobility and mortality also comes into play in this horizontal 1.5 degrees as shown. So again, let's see where, compared to 1.2 degrees, what happens at 1.5 degrees? So it's 0.5 degree difference. You would think that it doesn't matter, it's 0.5 degrees, so what? But then you have less extreme weather if it's 1.5 degrees, and the difference between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees is that its own sea level will be 10 centimeters lower, and that's a difference of 10 million fewer people being exposed to the risk. There's lower impact on biodiversity and species yields of rice, maize. We'll have half the global population only exposed to water shortages, lower risk to our fisheries and livelihood, and that 0.5 degrees, ladies and gentlemen, makes a difference of several 100 million fewer people being exposed to climate-related risks and susceptible to poverty. So if you imagine the world we have today, we have about 70 to 80 million people who are displaced because of conflict. And we have so many problems, even in our region, we are exposed to migrants coming in by and escaping conflict. Imagine having several 100 million people more to contend with. Hence, it is not surprising that tropical Southeast Asia is projected to experience the largest impact on economic growth. So now, when we talk about mitigation, there's always a very clear-cut difference. Yes, mitigation is for developed countries, and developing countries, we need room to grow. And that is right to a certain extent. But when we talk about adaptation, we must recognize that we have differentiated impacts. So what I have done here is pulled out the impacts from our 1.5 degree reports. I've extracted it for tropical Asia in the first column. Red means negative and it's getting a problem. And red in tropical Asia, I mean Southeast Asia as an example. Then there's temperate Asia, that's East Asia, tending to be more Japan, China, and northern parts of India. And then there's arid Asia, which is more the western part of Asia, which is dry. So bearing in mind that we have negative issues related with this region. So what are the issues that are projected? So we are expected to have heavy precipitation, and that's also expected in temperate Asia. Then the net reduction in yields of maize and rice and wheat, that's exclusively primarily in tropical Asia. So the impact is different. And then there's hot days projected with highest increases again in the tropics, that's us, in the tropics, and countries in the tropics are expected to have the largest impact on economic growth. Like I said, it's differentiated. Impacts are differentiated. A developed country will experience the same impacts as a developing country. And if you look here, the oceans report of the IPCC, again, tropical Asia, temperate Asia, arid Asia, you'll see the red boxes. They are associated with increases in marine heat waves, with significant wave heights that will be a problem for the coast. And then there's global biomass reduction, which will affect the fisheries catch potential, where the decline rates are highest in the tropics. Then you have your net primary production being affected negatively as well. And there'll be challenges to fisheries governance, particularly in the tropics. In this particular case, Pacific Ocean has been highlighted. Again, looking at the land report, what's the difference between tropical Asia, temperate Asia, and arid Asia? Negatively, in tropical Asia, that's Southeast Asia primarily, we have our many lives and livelihood jeopardized in cyclone-prone area. But in temperate Asia, you have a positive response here in blue, where growing seasons actually lengthen. And then in where there is increases in rainfall in tropical areas, if you have good vegetation growth, you may have positive, it may be negative. It's varied. Again, if you were to invest in forest cover in tropical region, you will have some form of cooling. And if you were to go for deforestation, then warming is this one. Whereas in temperate Asia, you have it as a very positive gain. And again, in tropical regions under high emission scenarios, warming will result in the emergence of unprecedented climatic conditions. So what actions can we take now? Oh, don't be so defeatist. Can we take? Yes, of course we can take actions. But there are limiting this warming to 1.5 degrees. It requires changes on an unprecedented scale. COVID-19 is unprecedented. You see, if we can do it now for COVID-19, we can go unprecedented to limit this risk of warming to humanity. But it requires deep emission cuts in all sectors, not just the energy sector. And for this, you need to deploy a range of technologies. We need behavioral changes, and we need increased investment in low carbon options. So this COVID-19 phase is an opportunity for us to get our investments right. And we need urgent and far-reaching actions where emissions must peak before 2030 so that we can get that 1.5 pathway en route to that 1.5 pathway. Carbon dioxide must fall by almost 45% by 2030, reaching net zero in 2050. And bearing in mind, we have a lot of developing nations, we need ethical and fair transition. And limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees is not impossible, but we need political and societal will to do it. And you, ladies and gentlemen, you have a big role to play in this context. So I'm just sharing with you some of the pathways that IPCC has identified. They have identified on your right, you'll see P1, P2, P3, P4 on the right, on the left graph. And in addition to those pathways, which are essentially about carbon dioxide emission, we also have to reduce methane emission, black carbon emission, and nitrous oxide emission. Those emissions you see on your right, they do not have to go to zero, but they have to be reduced. And if you reduce these emissions, air pollution will be so much more reduced in cities. So we in the city will have better air to breathe. So these short-lived climate forces, when we reduce them, they benefit nobody but us. So the city is going to be benefiting. But in terms of the carbon dioxide emission, where we have to find the pathway 1, 2, and pathway 3 to pathway 4, pathway 1 is the pathway that actually is my favorite pathway, ladies and gentlemen. It requires the least actions in terms of intensity of actions and cost. And pathway 4 is the most expensive and the most technology intensive. So let's just look at the two extremes. In this pathway 1, we social, business, and technological innovations, they result in lower energy demand. We take ambitious cuts as well, and afforestation is the only carbon dioxide removal option. But take a note here, primary energy from coal will have to go down by almost be eliminated from the system. Oil has to go down by 87% and 74% reduction in energy from gas. So this is the pathway that we actually want to transition to as soon as possible. And in the fourth pathway, it's very resource and energy expensive. It's very expensive, and we will find that we have to do it anyways because there'll be so much of impact in the world, and we'll have to have bioenergy and carbon capture storage coming into play. But take note, again, coal is nowhere in the system. We only reduce our energy by 32% and by half our energy from gas. So in all of these pathways, we have to reduce and remove ourselves from fossil fuel. Does this take away anything from sustainable development goals. So look on the left here, you see SDG 1 to SDG 17. Our IPCC authors have reviewed the literature and over 3,000, in fact, pieces of peer-reviewed literature. What they've done is they've summarized it. Blue here means potential synergies. That means they benefit, the action benefits each other in terms of energy supply, energy demand, and land. And brown is trade-off. There is some negative effect. And the length denotes the strength of the connection to the SDG. The message you have to see here, ladies and gentlemen, is that by doing mitigation action, there are so much potential for synergy, and the connection is to achieving the SDG is so strong. Actions for mitigation doesn't take anything away from achieving sustainable development goals. That's the message you want to take away from this slide. So what is the overview of progress reports on adaptation in ASEAN member states? So ASEAN member states are very serious. You will see from this blue notches here, we have this nationally determined contribution. All ASEAN member states have ratified the Paris Agreement, is my understanding from the UNFCCC website. And then all of us have gone into at least the second national communication where we report progress on adaptation. And Singapore is advanced into their fourth national communication, and other countries are preparing their third, and Indonesia is onto its third national communication, as is Vietnam and Thailand, very advanced. And 3 of our ASEAN member states have done their national program on adaptation actions. They've identified what are the critical needs. These are our least developed countries from Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar. So the adaptation is very strongly focused on in ASEAN, I'm happy to note. But the truth is that adaptation is already occurring. Used to be people think that adaptation is a far away thing. But in Southeast Asia, you can see it's about development planning. It's about investing in early warning system. It's about mangrove reforestation, managing water resources better. All of these are no regret options and are low-hanging fruits to handle adaptation. The IPCC has already evidence that if you want effective risk management, it has to be tailored to the local needs and circumstances. Because as you see, the projected impacts vary, hence the response also vary, and each region has its own unique vulnerabilities and exposure to hazards. So we need to take, to be effective in risk management, it has to take into account exposure and vulnerability. And it is in this context that IPCC looks into hazards, which is the potential of occurring things, and vulnerability, which is the system's predisposition to be affected, and looking into exposure, which is the presence of people, livelihood, ecosystems, and risk straddles hazards, vulnerability, and exposure right in the middle. And you have your impacts then affect socio-economic processes, and then emissions that then again affect the anthropogenic climate change in this context. So why is this risk framing important? It's very important because it facilitates this notion that we can, the impacts of climate variability and change can be prevented. So that gives us that power. So we can prevent it. And it's important to drive adaptation efforts and encourage focus on the most vulnerable groups. And we can now perceive risk as a continuum. And if you were to actually apply it on a very specific area, you will see that DRR measures can target the short-term risk, and then the climate change adaptation addresses the long-term threats. So you can take it as a continuum. And this is very important for Southeast Asia because the majority of disasters that affects ASEAN member countries are climate driven. They are in terms of floods and storm and drought. Yes, we have earthquake and volcanic eruptions, but it's the climate-related threat that will account for 30% of the GDP damage across cities in the region. And this has been assessed by Lloyd's Commission and work done by Cambridge. And the first step to adaptation to future climate change is to reduce vulnerability and exposure to present-day climate variability. So as I said, the IPCC promotes this as a continuum, and disaster risk reduction is actually a great entry point for us. In Malaysia, we try to do this because if you look at disaster prevention, all of us go through this prevention aspect where you have laws and land use zoning, mitigation where you have engineering fixes and biophysical structures to help with disaster mitigation, preparedness where you have simulation for rescue operations, you have early warning, then you go to response where you actually do the rescue, and then the recovery phase. And how does this connect with climate change? As the IPCC said, the first step to adaptation is to reduce the current vulnerability and exposure. So as you do disaster prevention, disaster mitigation, and preparedness, you can look into adaptation actions as well. And as after a disaster and you're recovering, this is the opportunity to look at climate change mitigation, about making wise investments in low carbon technology, investments in renewable, investments in energy efficiency. So this is the time to do all of that. So it is a continuum, and this is why as you take these actions, you'll be fulfilling not only the Sendai framework on disaster risk reduction, but SDG 13 on climate change, as well as the Paris Agreement. So in this context, I'm just sharing with you a local level initiative that I had the pleasure to read with Lord Julian Hunt from University of Cambridge, my partner, funded by Innovate UK and MITE under this Newton Unku Omar program, where we developed for the first time, we downscale meteorological parameters for the city of Kuala Lumpur. You see the meteorological parameters in the first block, and then we use this input to do hazards modeling, where we looked into both geophysical hazards as well as atmospheric hazards, and we brought it all to a multi-hazard platform. And this is to help the city manage and communicate risks in a changing climate. So we had downscale local weather forecasts of 3 days and 7 days. And for that same period, we have hazard forecasts for both the atmospheric and the geophysical hazards. And then we allow for a disaster alert so the respondents are ready, and public warning is then possible in that context. So this multi-hazard platform, this little photo that you see here that just popped up, it's just a small, it's a table, a desktop table kind of setting, where cities can use this to actually help them to manage multiple risks from one platform. So if I may end and just in this context, talk about how every bit of warming matters. 0.5 degrees, the difference is 100 million souls who will be displaced, who will be under risk due to climate change. So every bit of warming matters. If we limit to 1.5 degrees Celsius, every year also matters. The faster we take action, the cheaper it is. All too often we hear about how, mitigation in Southeast Asia, we contribute so little to mitigation. But look at the impacts that Southeast Asia is going to get. So we need to push for ambitious emission reduction from all countries that emit higher than us. And all the time we should be transforming ourselves so that we are also reducing our emission, because every little bit matters as well, and every year matters. We have to the sooner we take action, the cheaper it is. The longer we wait, the more expensive it will be for us. So, and when you're doing the costing, you have to take into account not only the cost of the mitigation, but also the cost of the physical risks that come into play. So only then your cost will be comprehensive, and every choice we make matters. Do we choose to have a lifestyle that is low carbon related? Do we choose to request our governments to transition faster? The choice is so important. So every little choice matters. And in that context, I note that we have 60% of us who got the answer right. And we know that the risks associated with climate change impacts, and we know that mitigation is the pathway to go, and we really need to take these actions. And those of us, as Albert Einstein rightly pointed out, those of us who have this privilege to know we have a duty to act. So I hope that everybody will do their bit so that we can have a resilient world, and a world that is where we can eliminate this 100 million people coming under risk if we do not limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. With that, I thank you very much for listening to me, and I pass the session back to Dr. Chan for a discussion session, because I look forward to hearing from you. Thank you, Dr. Chan.
Thank you, Professor Joy Pereira. Thanks for the extremely important messages and reminders. So now I can see there are a lot of posted questions. So just let me start with this one. Maybe it's just, I think this will get a lot of attention from the participants. So this is a question that they are who is asking, like, okay, so for the pandemic, the COVID-19, and compared to combating the climate change. So we have learned that, from media, and so that get a lot of attention in how to fighting the pandemic. However, when we compare with combating climate change, it looks like combating climate change get lesser attention compared to the pandemic. So in your view, how can we gain the same attention in addressing climate change?
Thank you, and that is a really good question, the pandemic versus the existential threat of climate change. Personally speaking, I think that this pandemic has been very bad for the world, and I am so sorry for the lives how hundreds and thousands of lives that have been lost, and the millions of people who are suffering. But herein lies the opportunity for us, from the recovery, from the economic recovery plans that we have. This is the time we are on a pause button, and we can reevaluate our investments. And I think the EU has been talking about this, and they have been investing, proposing investment in more carbon neutral investments and I hope that all governments in the region will use this opportunity to move into renewables and focus on energy efficiency, and make our transition, speeden up our transition while taking deep cuts. So it's not that we have ignored climate change. In my view, is that we need to make the investment better, so we do not take the pathway that will make climate change the existential threat that it is today. I hope that answers part of the question, at least.
Thank you, Prof. So we have another interesting question. So now, like here, we have you as scientists that sharing the knowledge. But how about in terms of science and policy communication? Is that a platform, like from your experience, is that a platform for scientists and the policymaker that they discuss like climate change together so that, sharing the knowledge and so as the scientists to understand the policymakers' direction?
Right. So IPCC has developed these reports based on peer-reviewed journals and come up with some summary for policymakers. So the product which comes up as a summary for policymakers is actually a joint product between scientists and policymakers. So this one comes from the science policy domain. And in that context, perhaps what we need is more capacity in terms of making the science more simple for policymakers to understand. And in that context, we have another product, which is the frequently answered questions coming out with our report. So we hope that the communication can improve to policymakers on how we should what the science is saying. Sometimes I'd be the first to admit we scientists tend to complicate things. So we need specialists in communication to come in and translate that science into simple messages that resonates with the policymaker. So oftentimes, I think at the end of the day, the scientists, the policymaker, the community, we all want the same thing. We all want clean air. We all want a climate that is going to be free of disasters. We all want our children to grow up in a safe environment. So the messaging in this context is important so that the policymakers have a better appreciation. But given that, we all also need to develop and prosper. And in that context, we need to take a trajectory of prospering of our development gains. We should be changing the trajectory. And in Southeast Asia in particular, we should move to a low carbon development in that context. Thank you, Dr. Chan.
Thank you, Prof. So maybe something related to this question, because Prof, please correct me if I'm wrong. So a lot of time I found that the community from the energy sector and the climate change group are working in silos. So do you often come across such situation when dealing with the policymakers? And if you do, in your view, what could be the root cause of that? Is that something related like we have just discussed the science communication, or is that any other reason?
Okay, so in IPCC, we have working group 1, which is the physical scientists. Working group 2, where I come from, where we look at impacts and adaptation. And working group 3, where we look at mitigation. And let me tell you this special report on 1.5 degrees global warming, it is the first product that integrates the finding of working group 1, 2, and 3 as a special report. So it took it was only in the 6th assessment cycle that the scientists could come together and the science had evolved enough for us to actually have this high level of integration and give you a specific temperature in the context of how the GHG emission translates to. So if the science has just come together with this report, I am not surprised that policymakers are also in their different silos. So policymakers, they tend to have, you have the energy people in the economic development sector, and then you have your adaptation, which always comes in under environment. Because of this, what happens is that you have this communication gap. So I think it's important to policymakers recognize that they should broaden. Climate change is a multidisciplinary, multi-sectoral issue. So no one sector or no one discipline can handle this alone, and it should be mainstreamed into the main development plans of a nation to actually make effect, to have effect. And if you see this 1.5 report, we are saying that we want emission reduction, not only from the energy sector, but also the building, from industry, from transportation. So all these sectors have a major role to play, and it has to be mainstream, and they have to be made aware. There's a lot of work ahead for us, but we have to start that work. Dr. Chan, back to you.
Thank you. Yes, I do agree that it is so important to have the integration. Yeah, so I think that's a great place to end. So thank you very much for having taken time to join us today, Professor Joy. So really appreciate it.
Very welcome.
So,
thank you for having me.
So after learning from Professor Joy, have you changed your perception of climate change? So now you may have an opportunity to choose again the question 2, because the question 1, we have very high 90% that voted for the serious threat to human and ecosystem. So now we just re-vote again, and we are so curious to see whether is there any changes of your perception. So please vote again, even though you have the same perception, but we just want to see the number of changes. You have half of a minute from now. Right. So, okay, not too bad. We have an increase. So it was 64% that chosen the
10%
mitigation cost rise over time, Prof. So now we have 75. Congratulations. And Prof, I'm so glad to see these changes. So I think your messages have been well received. So thank you very much for enlightening us. So, okay. So we are now coming to the end. And before we go, I would like to just allow me to make a promotion for our next event. So next event, we are going to have a launching talk to promote our policy brief publication on renewable energy investment in ASEAN. So it will be on the 6th of August. So please join us. And then the link is actually posted at the chat box. And next, we also would like you to join us if you're interested in joining the mailing list that are next. So the link to join is also posted at the chat box. So please join us if you're interested to have the mailing list from us and the discussion. So, and another thing is, in a minute, you will be asking to evaluate this webinar. So, and then we appreciate very much if you could fill in the evaluation form for us. So, and then seeing that maybe we can still have 5 minutes. So, Prof, maybe we just get these 5 minutes to discuss more, whatever that we can before we end.
Okay, absolutely.
Maybe you can, because as ASEAN Center for Energy, our nature of work is a lot of energy based, and I would say that is mitigation in terms of the energy sector. What would be the key message that you would like to give to the community of energy sector, like in combating climate change?
Yeah, I think the takeaway message that's important for all mitigation specialists to know is that mitigation, unlike, is very simple. It's about, generally you talk about developed country having more technology and developing country having a lesser one, a capacity. But when it comes to adaptation, I just like to emphasize that it doesn't matter whether you're developed or developing. As a region, ASEAN is very much exposed, and the projection is that we would as we move towards 1.5, this is the region that will have the most economic deficit into whatever gains you have would have been, there's a potential of losing the economic gains. So given that, I think ASEAN policymakers in the energy sector should start looking at ASEAN as a region and coming together and formulating strategies and on how you can make countries especially the big emitting countries, to take ambitious targets and limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. But at the same time, ASEAN itself is transforming to be ready for that new economy that will come into play. So that is the message that I want to give the energy specialists in mitigation. The question most often they say, ASEAN contributes very little to mitigation, so there's no point in transforming. That is not the point. The point is the impacts are going to be higher, and you need to limit global warming to 1.5, and the faster we transform, the better it becomes, and the more we can limiting emission, calling for ambitious targets from all countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prof. Yes, I totally agree with you. It is so important. And how would you say that, for example, that because in this region, relatively the awareness is not that high compared to the developed country. So in your view, how can we increase the awareness in an effective way?
In terms of increasing awareness, I think there are many ways to do it. Sometimes we think that the person on the ground doesn't realize that things are changing, but they are changing. Is that they don't know what is driving it? They are not aware of that. So that messaging has to go across to the man on the street, that change you're experiencing, that sea level rise, that inundation that suddenly happens, and in the sea level, or that weather that is used to be predictable that is now totally different. That change is human driven, and that's a message that every one of us have a role to play. All of us have a role to play, not just the scientists, the people in this room. Every one of you have a role to play to get that message out that we can change the pathway.
Yes, we have to choose the future that we want, right?
Yes, exactly. You said it right on the dot. Choose the future what you want. And even Dr. Nuki stressed on the next generation. What do we want for the next generation? Yeah. So adaptation of energy assets, all those things come into play.
Thank you so much, Professor Joy. So once again, it's our great pleasure to have you today. And with that, we would like to conclude for today's webinar. And thank you everyone for your participation, and hope to see you again for our next event. Thank you and bye.
Thank you for having me, Dr. Chan.
Thank you, Professor Joy.
Thank you, Dr.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.